At 9:17 on a cold September morning, Darius Holden was standing outside his daughter's school when his phone buzzed for the third time. He looked at the screen. Mandatory meeting. Attendance required. He stared at the message, then at Maeve sitting beside him on the school office bench, pale and embarrassed because the bus had been canceled and no one had been able to pick her up. Darius had already called work. He had already explained. Now he had a choice. Leave his 10-year-old daughter alone with a school secretary he barely knew, or miss the meeting and deal with whatever came next. He put the phone back in his pocket. "You're not going anywhere by yourself," he told Maeve. She nodded. Darius stayed. "If you're watching this, tell us your age, where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had to choose between your job and your family." Darius had spent most of his adult life trying not to make that choice. At 42, he was an employee benefits coordinator at a large manufacturing company outside Chicago, the kind of job most people noticed only when something went wrong. He handled leave requests, benefits questions, payroll corrections, and the paperwork that appeared whenever real life collided with company policy. He was good at it because he understood that employees were not numbers on a spreadsheet. They had sick parents, daycare problems, school calls, broken cars, and lives that did not always respect a 9-to-5 schedule. But Darius had one weakness. He hated conflict. After his divorce, stability had become more important than being right. Maeve needed a steady home. He needed a steady paycheck. So he had learned to swallow small frustrations and keep moving. By 10:03, Maeve was safely in class after the school arranged temporary transportation. Darius drove toward the company with both hands tight on the steering wheel. He expected a difficult conversation. He did not expect to be fired. The conference room was already empty when he arrived. A folder sat on the table. His supervisor would not meet his eyes. At the far end of the room stood Helena Merritt, the company's 46-year-old CEO, wearing a charcoal jacket over a pale blue blouse. She slid the folder toward him. "You missed a mandatory meeting," she said. Darius looked at the folder but did not open it. "I told them why." Helena's expression stayed controlled. "I know." A pause. Then she said, "And I'm still terminating your employment." Darius finally looked up. He wasn't angry yet. He was trying to understand how one missed meeting could erase 12 years of showing up for everything else. The folder stayed closed for several seconds. Darius looked at Helena, then at the supervisor standing near the window, waiting for him to react. He wanted to argue. He wanted to ask why 12 years of clean performance could disappear because he missed one meeting. But the first thought that came to him was Maeve. Her school pickup. Her homework. The mortgage payment due next week. He opened the folder instead. The termination letter was already signed. "Is there an appeal process?" he asked. Helena nodded once. "You can submit one through employee relations." Darius thanked her, picked up the folder, and left. No speech. No slammed door. Just the soft click of the conference room behind him. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand the man who walked out of it. Darius had never been the loudest person at the company. He didn't chase promotions, collect executive contacts, or stay late just so somebody important would notice. His office was on the 4th floor, 3 doors down from the employee services desk, where people came when a benefits form made no sense or a family emergency suddenly changed their schedule. He knew most of their names. More importantly, he remembered what they had told him. Marisol in shipping had a mother recovering from surgery. Kevin from maintenance had a son starting community college. Priya in accounting had once called him at 6 in the morning because she couldn't figure out whether her leave paperwork would cover the birth of her second child. Darius had helped them because that was his job. But over the years, it had become more than paperwork. He had become the person employees trusted when they didn't know who else to ask. He also knew the limits of that trust. He had no authority to change company policy. He couldn't approve raises. He couldn't overrule managers. And he couldn't protect everyone from decisions made several floors above him. That was partly why he avoided conflict. After his marriage ended, Darius had learned to measure every risk against Maeve's stability. He didn't want his daughter hearing him complain about work every night. He didn't want her wondering whether they would have to move. He wanted ordinary things: groceries in the refrigerator, her school shoes by the door, enough money in savings for the next unexpected expense. Ordinary had become a form of success. That afternoon, he drove home through a light September rain. The leaves along the residential streets had started turning at the edges, yellow showing through green. Maeve was at the kitchen table working on a science assignment when he came through the door. She looked up immediately. "You're home early." Darius put the termination folder face down on the counter. "Yeah," he said. "Work changed a little today." Maeve studied his face. "Children notice more than adults think they do. Are you in trouble?" Darius forced a small smile. "No, I just have some paperwork to deal with." He didn't tell her yet. Not because he wanted to lie, but because he needed one night to figure out what came next. After dinner, while Maeve worked on her project in the next room, Darius opened his laptop and began reading the employee handbook. He found the attendance policy, then the section on mandatory meetings, then the appeal procedure. He read every line twice. Somewhere in those pages was the answer to a question he had never expected to ask: whether missing one meeting really meant 12 years of work no longer counted. And for the first time since leaving the office, Darius stopped thinking about getting his job back. He started thinking about whether the decision itself had been fair. The first person to call Darius the next morning was Marisol from shipping. She did not ask whether he had found another job. She asked a different question. "Did they really fire you over that meeting?" Darius stood at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling beside him, while Maeve searched for her backpack in the hallway. "That's what the letter says." Marisol was quiet for a moment. "Then I guess I'm not the only one who doesn't understand it." Darius almost asked what she meant, but she changed the subject. "I hope you're okay." After they hung up, Darius opened his laptop again. He had spent most of the previous night reading company policies, but now he started looking at something else: the messages employees had sent him over the years. Not complaints exactly. Small requests. Questions about schedules. Confusion about leave forms. Notes from people asking whether a manager could deny a family emergency. None of them looked important by themselves. Together, they painted a picture he had been too busy surviving to notice. At the company, people had become careful. They stopped asking for exceptions because they had learned that exceptions came with explanations, and explanations could become records. A technician named Kevin once told Darius he had used vacation time to take his son to a doctor's appointment because he didn't want his supervisor thinking he was unreliable. Priya in accounting had apologized 3 times before asking whether maternity leave could be adjusted around a medical appointment. Another employee had quietly traded shifts for months rather than tell her manager that her mother could no longer drive. Darius had helped where he could. He had never connected the stories. Now he did. None of these people had been fired. None had made a formal complaint. They had simply learned how to work around the system. That afternoon, Darius drove to the company parking lot to return his laptop and badge. The building looked exactly the same as it always had. Glass doors, gray concrete, employees moving through the lobby with coffee cups and phones in their hands. Nothing outside had changed. Inside, something had. Kevin met him near the entrance. "You don't have to come back," Darius said. Kevin gave a tired smile. "I know. Then why are you here?" Kevin looked toward the elevators. "Because I wanted to see you." Darius shook his head. "Don't make this about me." Kevin frowned. "What else is it about?" Darius had no good answer. Before he could respond, Marisol walked through the doors carrying a folder. Then Priya arrived. Then 2 people from maintenance. They were not a crowd. Not yet. They stood around him in awkward silence, each seeming unsure why they had come. Darius looked at their faces and felt something he hadn't expected. Not anger. Responsibility. He had spent years helping people solve problems one at a time. Now he was beginning to see that some problems were connected. Across the lobby, Helena Merritt stepped out of the elevator and stopped when she saw them gathered together. She did not walk over. Neither did Darius. For a few seconds, they simply looked at each other. Then Helena turned toward her office. Darius watched her disappear behind the glass doors and realized the question was no longer whether he could get his job back. It was whether anyone inside that building was willing to ask why so many people had learned to stay quiet. By Friday morning, Darius had read the employee handbook so many times that he could almost recite the attendance section from memory. The rule was clear. Mandatory meetings required attendance unless an employee had approved leave or an emergency was documented. What bothered him was the sentence underneath it. Managers were expected to consider the circumstances surrounding an absence. Darius read that line again. Then he opened the email he had sent before the meeting. He had notified his supervisor. He had explained that Maeve was stranded at school. He had asked to join by phone. The request had been denied. He had not disappeared. He had made a choice. Now he needed to know whether the company had made one too. At 8:30 that morning, Darius submitted a formal appeal through employee relations. He attached the email, the school notification, and the meeting invitation. He did not accuse Helena of targeting him. He did not call the firing cruel. He simply asked the company to review whether the policy had been applied consistently. 2 hours later, a representative named Sandra Cole called him. "Your appeal has been received," she said. "There may be an opportunity to resolve this quickly." Darius sat at his kitchen table while Maeve worked on a reading assignment nearby. "What does that mean?" he asked. Sandra hesitated. "The company is willing to discuss reinstatement." Darius felt something loosen in his chest. For the first time all week, he could imagine walking back into the building. Then Sandra continued. There would be an agreement. She explained that Darius could return if he acknowledged that missing the meeting violated company expectations and agreed not to challenge the disciplinary decision further. Darius looked at the refrigerator. Maeve's school calendar was held there by a magnet shaped like a red apple. Rent was due in less than 2 weeks. His savings would not last forever. He wanted to say yes. More than that, he needed to say yes. But one sentence kept bothering him. If the company was willing to bring him back only after he accepted that everything about the firing was justified, what exactly had the appeal been for? "Can I have the agreement in writing?" he asked. Sandra said she would send it. That afternoon, Darius took the document to a quiet coffee shop near the library. He read it slowly. The language was professional. Nothing sounded threatening. That almost made it harder. The agreement described his absence as a failure to meet a reasonable workplace expectation. It said the company had acted appropriately. It did not mention the email he had sent beforehand. It did not mention the school emergency. It did not mention the fact that remote attendance had been allowed for other employees under similar circumstances. Darius closed the document. He thought about Maeve. He thought about the people who had called him after the firing. Marisol, Kevin, Priya. People who had quietly rearranged their lives around rules because they were afraid of being seen as unreliable. If he signed, he would get his job back. Maybe that was enough. Maybe being right was a luxury he could not afford anymore. Then his phone buzzed. It was a message from Kevin. "They're asking us about you at work." Darius stared at the screen. Another message followed. "People are talking." He put the phone face down. He did not want a movement. He did not want people risking their jobs for him. He wanted a fair review. Nothing more. That evening, he called Sandra. His voice was calm. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't sign a statement saying the circumstances didn't matter when they clearly did." Sandra was silent. "Are you rejecting reinstatement?" she asked. Darius looked toward the hallway where Maeve was brushing her teeth. "I'm asking the company to review the decision honestly." When the call ended, Darius sat alone at the kitchen table. He knew what he had just done. He had chosen uncertainty over the fastest path back to security. For the first time, he was no longer simply trying to protect his job. He was asking whether protecting his family required him to stay silent. By Monday morning, Darius had received 11 messages before he finished making Maeve's lunch. None of them came from Helena. They came from people he used to see every day. Some asked whether he had heard anything from employee relations. Others wanted to know what they could do. One message from Marisol simply said, "People are upset." Darius stared at that one for a while. Then he typed, "Please don't do anything because of me." He deleted it. Typed it again. Deleted it again. Finally, he sent, "Whatever you decide, make sure you're deciding for yourselves." At the company, the mood was different from the usual Monday morning rush. People still scanned badges, answered phones, and carried coffee toward their desks, but conversations stopped when managers walked by. Helena had asked department heads to remind employees that the attendance policy remained in effect and that Darius's case was being reviewed through the proper process. On paper, everything sounded calm. In practice, people were watching one another. At 10:15, Kevin called Darius. "Can I come by?" Darius agreed. Kevin arrived 20 minutes later, followed by Marisol and Priya. They sat around Darius's kitchen table while Maeve worked quietly in the next room. Nobody knew how to begin. Darius finally said, "If this is about getting me back, don't." Marisol frowned. "Why not?" "Because I don't want anybody losing their job over mine." Kevin leaned forward. "That's not why we're here." Darius looked at him. "Then why are you here?" Kevin took a breath. "Because I used vacation time last month to take my son to a doctor appointment. I wasn't sick. I didn't want to explain it to my supervisor." Priya spoke next. I changed a medical appointment because I was afraid my manager would think I wasn't committed. Marisol looked down at her coffee. I traded 3 shifts last year when my mom needed help. I never told anyone why. Darius listened. These were not stories he had never heard. He had heard pieces of them for years. What he had never understood was how many people were making the same calculations he had made. Keep your head down. Protect your paycheck. Don't become difficult. That's bigger than my firing, Darius said quietly. Kevin nodded. That's what we're trying to tell you. Darius shook his head. No, I'm telling you not to make this about me. The room went silent. He looked at each of them. I'm a 42-year-old father who missed a meeting. I made a choice. Maybe you disagree with it. That's fine. But if you think something is wrong at work, you need to decide what you're willing to stand behind, even if my name isn't part of it. Marisol asked, so what are you saying we should do? Nothing, Darius said. Not because nothing is wrong. Because I can't make that choice for you. That answer surprised them. It also changed the conversation. Instead of planning a protest, they began comparing experiences. By the end of the afternoon, they had written down 13 separate situations involving schedules, family emergencies, and inconsistent enforcement. None involved the same manager. None had the same details. But they shared one thing. People had learned to stay quiet because they were afraid of what speaking up might cost. The list was not a petition. It wasn't a threat. It was simply evidence that the problem existed beyond one meeting. That evening, Darius printed a copy and left it on his kitchen table. He looked at the pages, then at Maeve's backpack by the door. He had spent days believing his biggest decision was whether to get his job back. Now he understood that the harder question belonged to everyone else. Would they keep protecting themselves one person at a time, or would they finally decide what they were willing to risk together? By Wednesday, the list on Darius's kitchen table had become something larger than he expected. 27 employees had added their names to the document, not as protesters, but as people willing to describe what had happened to them. There were no dramatic accusations. Most of the stories were ordinary. A mother who had used unpaid time to attend her son's school conference. A mechanic who had worked through a fever because he was afraid of being marked unreliable. An employee who had stopped asking for schedule changes after being told, twice, that family problems were not the company's responsibility. Darius read every statement carefully. Then he noticed something that made him uncomfortable. Several employees had written about situations where he had been involved, not as the person who caused the problem, as the person who helped them work around it. He had thought he was helping people. Now he wondered whether he had also helped the company avoid seeing the problem. At 7:40 that evening, Helena Merritt received the document. It came from Employee Relations, not Darius. She opened it expecting a complaint about one termination. Instead, she found 27 statements. She read the first 3 standing at her desk. By the 7th, she sat down. By the 12th, she stopped reading like a CEO reviewing a personnel issue and started reading like a person trying to understand what had happened inside her own company. None of the employees used the same language. That was what bothered her most. There was no coordinated campaign, no single complaint template, no obvious organizer. The stories were different because the people were different, but the decisions they described had the same shape. When life became inconvenient, employees learned to hide it. Helena called her chief operating officer. How many of these situations have we seen? She asked. He looked uncomfortable. Probably more than what's documented. Why? He hesitated. Because most people don't file anything. Helena looked back at the pages. She had spent 2 years telling managers that consistency was the foundation of fairness. She still believed that, but she was beginning to see the problem. Consistency without judgment could become another kind of unfairness. The next morning, Helena scheduled a meeting with department managers. She expected resistance. What she got was silence. She asked whether managers had been trained to distinguish a legitimate emergency from deliberate absenteeism. They had. She asked whether those standards were applied consistently. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one manager said, "Not always." Another admitted that supervisors sometimes enforced rules more strictly because they believed executives wanted fewer exceptions. Helena looked around the room. "Did I tell you that?" she asked. No one spoke. "Did I ever tell you to punish people for having families?" Still nothing. The answer was uncomfortable because it was complicated. Helena had not said those words, but she had built a system where people had learned to guess what she wanted. That afternoon, she decided to speak directly to the workforce. Her communications team prepared a statement emphasizing accountability and professionalism. Helena read it once and crossed out half the language. She didn't want another corporate message. She wanted to ask questions. At 4 o'clock, employees gathered in the main conference hall. Darius was not there. He had deliberately stayed away. Helena stood at the front of the room without a prepared speech. "I know many of you disagree with the decision to terminate Darius Holden," she began. "I also know some of you believe the issue is larger than one employee." A few people shifted in their seats. Helena continued, "I am not asking you to agree with me. I am asking you to tell me what I have failed to see." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then a young employee named Tessa stood. She described missing a morning shift 2 months earlier because her mother had fallen in her apartment. She had called her manager before leaving. She was still given a written warning. Another employee followed. Then another. Helena listened. She did not defend the policy. She did not promise anyone anything. She simply wrote down what they said. Meanwhile, Darius sat at home beside Maeve's homework papers, unaware of exactly what was happening inside the building. His phone remained face down on the table. He had made one decision weeks earlier. He would not tell people what to do. Whatever happened next had to belong to them. At 4:18 on Friday afternoon, Helena Merritt stood at the front of the main conference hall and looked at a room that had become unusually quiet. The meeting had started as a follow-up to the employee statements. Instead, people had begun asking a harder question. What would happen if nothing changed? Helena had no prepared answer. She had spent the week listening, reviewing policies, and asking managers questions she should have asked months earlier. But listening was not the same as fixing anything. Near the back of the room, Tessa stood and said, "We don't want another promise. We want to know whether we're allowed to disagree without being punished." Helena looked at her. "Yes," she said. "You should be." Tessa nodded, but she didn't sit down. "Then we need to show you how many people feel the same way." At 4:30, employees began leaving their desks. It happened without shouting, without a leader standing at the front telling everyone what to do. One person walked toward the elevators. Then another. A supervisor left his office and followed. 2 people from accounting came through the hallway carrying their coats. In the warehouse, employees finished the tasks that could not safely be abandoned, shut down equipment properly, and walked toward the main entrance. Helena watched from the lobby as the stream grew larger. She recognized faces. People she had greeted at quarterly meetings. People whose names she knew only from reports. People who had never spoken during an executive meeting. They were not holding signs. They were not chanting. They were simply leaving together. Someone from Human Resources counted them twice. The number passed 100, then 150, then 200. Outside, the early fall air was cool, and a light wind moved through the trees along the parking lot. Darius was not among them. He was at home helping Maeve finish a science project when his phone began vibrating on the kitchen counter. He ignored it once, then again. Finally, Maeve looked up. "Dad, your phone keeps ringing." Darius picked it up. There were 19 missed calls and dozens of messages. The first one he opened was from Marisol. "We're outside." Darius frowned. "Outside where?" Her reply came immediately. "The company. 200 of us." He sat down. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he called her. "Why?" Marisol laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Because you kept telling us not to do this for you." Darius looked across the kitchen at Maeve. "Then don't do it for me." "We're not," Marisol said. "That's the point." Darius closed his eyes. He understood then that the thing he had been trying to prevent had already happened. The employees were not following him. They were acting without him. Across the parking lot, Helena stepped outside. 200 people turned toward her. Nobody moved closer. Nobody shouted. For several seconds, the only sound was traffic passing on the street beyond the company gates. Helena looked at the employees, then at the empty building behind her. She finally understood what Darius had meant when he said the decision was bigger than him. The walkout was not his victory. It belonged to everyone standing there. By Monday morning, the headquarters building felt different. Not empty, exactly. Essential operations had continued through the weekend, but the usual noise was gone. Fewer voices in the hallways. Fewer coffee cups moving between offices. Entire rows of desks sat untouched. Helena Merritt arrived before 7 and walked through the 4th floor alone. She stopped outside Darius Holden's old office. His name was still printed on the small plastic label beside the door. She stood there for a moment, then kept walking. At 8:15, The board held an emergency meeting. Several directors wanted immediate action. One suggested terminating the employees who had participated in the walkout. Another argued that the company could replace them. Helena listened without interrupting. When the discussion ended, she said, "If we punish 200 people for exercising a choice they made peacefully, what exactly will we prove?" Nobody answered. The legal team had already confirmed that the employees had not damaged property, threatened anyone, or abandoned safety-critical equipment. The company could discipline them, but doing so would turn a workplace dispute into something much larger. Helena rejected the idea. "We're not going to retaliate," she said, "and we're not going to pretend this is over." Later that afternoon, she called Darius. He almost didn't answer. When he did, neither spoke for a few seconds. "Are you okay?" Helena asked. Darius looked toward the living room, where Maeve was watching television with a bowl of popcorn. "We're getting by." Helena took a breath. "I want to talk about what happens next." Darius expected an offer. Maybe his old position. Maybe a settlement. Instead, Helena said, "I don't want to discuss your job." He sat back. "Then what do you want to discuss?" "The employees." That caught his attention. Helena explained what had happened inside the company since the walkout. Managers were divided. Some believed the employees had crossed a line. Others admitted the walkout had forced conversations that should have happened months earlier. Helena had reviewed the attendance policy and found something she had missed before. The language was precise about violations, but vague about emergencies. Managers had been left to interpret the gray areas differently. "I can change the policy," she said. "That won't be enough," Darius replied. Helena was quiet. "Why?" "Because people won't trust a new paragraph just because you changed the paragraph." He told her that employees needed a way to raise concerns before problems became resignations, disciplinary actions, or walkouts. More importantly, they needed to know that speaking honestly would not make them targets. Helena asked him what he would build if he were in her position. Darius thought about it. "A process you don't control." She understood immediately. He suggested an employee council made up of workers from different departments, with rotating members and direct access to leadership. Its purpose would not be to overrule managers or run the company. It would review major workplace policies, flag unintended consequences, and give employees a formal place to speak before frustration became silence. Helena asked, "Would you serve on it?" Darius looked down at his hands. He did not want a title. He did not want to become the face of the walkout. "Only if everyone else chooses me," he said, "and only if I have no special authority." Helena agreed. Before the call ended, she said, "I still believe missing that meeting mattered." Darius nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Maybe it did." He paused. "But I think we both know it shouldn't have been the only thing that mattered." That evening, Helena returned to the empty conference room where she had fired him. The same table was still there, the same chairs, but now the room looked smaller. For the first time, she understood that leadership was not about making every decision alone. Sometimes it was about building a room where other people could tell you when you were wrong. 3 weeks after the walkout, Darius Holden stood outside the company headquarters with his hands in the pockets of a dark blue jacket, watching employees arrive for the first meeting under the new workplace agreement. The leaves along the sidewalk had turned gold and copper, and a cold October wind pushed them across the pavement. Nothing about the building looked different. The glass doors still opened at 7. The same security desk sat in the lobby. The same elevators carried people toward the same floors. But the way people walked through those doors had changed. They no longer looked as though they were waiting to see what the company would decide for them. They were there to participate in the decision. Darius had been invited to the meeting, but he had not been given a title. He had not been promoted. He had not received a special bonus. In fact, he had made one thing clear from the beginning. He would not return to his old position simply because the company wanted the story to have a neat ending. Helena had respected that. The new employee council would have rotating members from different departments, direct access to leadership, and a written rule protecting employees who raised concerns in good faith. Darius would serve for the first 6 months as one member among many, with no authority to speak for everyone else. Inside the conference room, Helena stood beside a long table while employees took their seats. Marisol sat near the window. Kevin was beside her. Priya had brought a notebook filled with questions. Tessa sat across from Helena, calm but firm. No one looked like a hero. No one looked like a villain. They looked like people who had finally decided to have a conversation before another crisis forced them to. Helena opened the meeting herself. "I want to say something before we begin," she said. "I fired Darius because I believed enforcing one standard was the same thing as being fair. I was wrong about that." Darius listened without reacting. Helena continued, "That doesn't mean rules don't matter. It means context matters too. And leadership has to be willing to hear the difference." Then she stepped away from the table. "So today, I don't want to be the person with the last word." The first question came from Kevin, then another from Priya, then someone from the warehouse. The conversation was uncomfortable at times. That was probably a good sign. Real change rarely feels polished while it is happening. Darius eventually spoke, but not about himself. "The biggest mistake we can make now is thinking the walkout solved everything," he said. "It didn't. It only proved people were willing to stop pretending everything was fine." Helena nodded. "And what happens next?" Darius looked around the room. "We keep talking before people get desperate enough to leave." That afternoon, Darius declined a formal offer to return to his former job. He had already accepted another position with a smaller company that offered more predictable hours, something that mattered to him as a father. He would still help with the council during its first months, but his life was moving in a different direction. When Maeve met him outside school that evening, she ran toward him with a backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Did they give you your old job back?" she asked. Darius smiled. "No." Maeve looked surprised. "Are you okay?" He took her hand. "Yeah. I think I finally learned that keeping a job and keeping your dignity aren't supposed to be enemies." They walked home beneath the fading autumn light. And maybe that is the part of the story worth remembering. A person's value has never been determined by a paycheck, a title, an expensive coat, or the size of their house. Rich or poor, powerful or struggling, every human being deserves to be treated with basic respect and love. Poverty does not make someone lesser. Wealth does not make someone better. What matters is how we choose to see one another when nobody is required to be kind. Darius lost a job over one missed meeting. But what he helped reveal was far bigger. People do not need to be rescued by a powerful person to stand together. Sometimes they simply need the courage to stop looking away.